This is part 9 of The Alchemist 2. Chapter 55, Cold Garden, 1854. Sophus Nielsen could only watch them dying. He'd wake up each morning hoping to see a change for the better, but each day, infection and decay stole a little bit more from them. Waking at Cold Garden always brought optimism for the first few minutes of the day. With the mountains behind him to the west, his tent flap opened to the rising sun, which at dawn illuminated miles of prairie as it ascended above the horizon. Professor Morgan sat outside, facing the same rising sun. "Good morning," Sophus greeted him. "Can I get you anything?" Professor Morgan shook his head. He'd been serving as doctor for the infirmed, a task that seemed to sap the last bit of strength he had. Then he scoffed. "Go find me that stone." Back at the Columbia River, several days earlier, Professor Morgan did all he could to just stop the bleeding. No sooner had he bandaged the wound than Chief Crooked Arm came riding in to warn that the Klickitat warriors were out in force and heading north. After spending months at Lake Columbia, they were packed and gone by the next day, traveling back through the narrow paths in the mountain to find relatives safely back on the prairie. Strangely enough, Lord Erskine had also fallen ill, an ailment in his bowels. With none of them capable of riding, Crooked Arm left to go get his healers at his camp in the north, leaving them camped at the Bow River. Perhaps I can go search once the healers return? Responsibility kept the professor at the side of his patients, but he told Sophus all about the black stone he'd been seen carried by the horse into the mountains. "Jameson Sinclair hauled it all the way out here for a purpose," he said after they left the carnage of the fight. "We must go back and find it." Now they camped 100 miles on the wrong side of the mountains. "I'll see what I can do," Sophus said, and walked to the tents of the others. The professor's dedication to his task was admirable, but Sophus worried more about the men. Lord Erskine sounded the worst. For the past 3 days, he groaned and moaned for hours on end, stopping only to blast his fecal matter onto the rocks outside his tent. He didn't even bother wearing pants, and when Sophus stepped into the tent, Lord Erskine had a blanket draped over his lower body. "Let me get you some fresh water," Sophus said. "The more you drink, the sooner this will pass." "The more I drink, the more I shit, in one end, out the other," Erskine bemused. The cold fire had a kettle of boiled water, and Sophus refilled Erskine's small pitcher. "Better get better soon. There are important decisions that need to be made." Next, he visited the tent of Vaktar Forsberg, who he expected to die soon. Forsberg's lower left arm had darkened, and the veins in his upper arms were inflamed. Since yesterday, his eyes hadn't opened, and his body shivered. He doesn't deserve to die so young. In hindsight, all the pettiness and rivalry between the two now seemed foolish. Vaktar had become like a brother to him. Sophus set a wet rag on his forehead and left to inspect Clement. Despite the loss of blood and the severe stab wounds, Clement never lost consciousness through it all. He only had strength to whisper, for if he tried speaking in a full voice, his lung wound brought horrible fits of coughing that ended up with him vomiting blood. "Good morning. Good to see you're still with us." "How's the boy?" Clement asked. Sophus sighed at the familiar question. "He's holding on. It'll be a beautiful day. It might do him good to spend it in the sun." The worst of Clement's wounds was the stab wound to his lung, where Jameson Sinclair sunk his blade at the beginning of the fight. Fortunately, Clement had found Forsberg's fillet knife on the edge of a nearby table, and the two mortal enemies pierced holes in each other until one submitted to the will of death. During the melee, Clement managed to bite the ear off Sinclair and in turn had his defensive arm stabbed 4 times. He had a 6th wound on his right side, which oozed blood slowly. His mood, by contrast, remained almost jovial. Any sign from Crooked Arm? It's still early. Did I thank you for saving me? I didn't save you, Sophus claimed. But he had saved Forsberg. Even though Clement had broken the neck of Jameson Sinclair, the final gunman would have killed Forsberg and Clement. Forsberg saved you. I made a promise, Clement began, but stopped with a cough. Save your strength. Rest for a few days, and then we'll worry about your promise. When delirious or dreaming, Clement would mutter bits and pieces about his broken promise, so Sophus understood the seriousness of his vow. After visiting everyone, he walked back to Professor Morgan. I'm going to take a horse and see if I can do a little hunting, he said, and climbed up on his horse. Before leaving, he called out to the professor. I'll keep an eye out for your black stone. They camped 2 days from the mountains, but along the river and the foothills, game was plentiful, and Chief Crooked Arm left them with plenty of ammunition as well as horses, including one with a travois. Sophus still didn't like riding, so he led the horse on a new path. He watched for animals drinking along the river. Today, a pair of large geese lingered in some foliage along the edge of the river, giving him time to get his rifle ready. When he took the shot, one of the geese flapped its wings erratically, but like Forsberg and Clement, it simply refused to die and flapped off another 10 yards. Oh, it stopped. Sophus followed leisurely, making sure he brought the horse with him. But when he reached the place, the goose had vanished. Just my luck. He walked into the brush a bit, stumbling at a place where the bank fell away. He almost fell forward into the water, but caught himself on a large stone. Well, this is curious. For a brief moment, he thought he'd stumbled across the black stone seen by Professor Morgan. His foot rested on a stone that looked like it almost had been carved or cut, if not for the rough edges on one side and a vein of whiter stone clinging to it like fat on a juicy steak. Bedrock? The river certainly could have smoothed the surface, and flooding could have snapped it off cleanly. The more he looked, the more the rectangle proved to be flawed with grooves and imperfection. It could make a nice headstone, Sophus grimly observed. It took all of his might, but he managed to haul it up the bank and secure it to the travois. They still had plenty of dried goods, but today his trophy brought him back home early. Professor Morgan will think I've found his black stone, Sophus grinned at his unintentional prank. A half-mile from camp, Sophus stopped the horse. Trouble. Chief Crooked Arm had left 4 of his best warriors to stay with him until he returned, and all 4 men, as well as the Professor Morgan, stood armed. A group of 30 riders stopped in a cluster just in front of the camp. One of them dismounted and stepped forward. The burly white man, wore the black robes of a Jesuit missionary. Whether friend or foe, I hope he can help heal my friends. Chapter 56, Cold Garden, 1854. Louis Carnes rose from bed feeling significantly better than the previous day and thought, it looks like I live to fight another day. The medicine given to him by the Jesuit had done the trick. When he dressed, though, he did not dress in the clothes of Lord Wesley Erskine, since the ruse was over and Clement had gotten his revenge. Today he dressed in the clothes of Sergeant Louis Carnes. Carnes stepped outside to the cool air of autumn. The 30 Arikara escorts were camped along the Bow River still, and sitting at the center of the throng, Father Pierre-Jean de Smet rose and walked over. From the adjacent tent, Professor Morgan and young Nielsen also stood, advancing to him. They'll look to me for leadership now. How long have I been ill? We managed to save the boy's foot, but the arm had to be removed at the elbow, DeSmit said. With the infection cut away, the boy is already doing better. Clement, however, survives only by the grace of God. Carnes extended his hand, and a strong, meaty hand shook it tightly. Louis Carnes. DeSmet turned to Morgan with a wry smile. I was under the impression that you were a Scottish lord. Your medicine saved my life. I owe you an honest accounting. An honest accounting? DeSmet scoffed. Do you know who I am? The boy told me your name last night, but I've known the name DeSmet for several years now. Yes, I am your ally. I've been your ally since before Stuart's family heirloom was stolen, and even before Nicollet decided to come to America. I know about the secret war that wages, and I am here to give the indigenous people a voice in the madness. Even while I'm out here on the edge of the frontier, I receive correspondence from the other side of the world. Before I found you, I knew Lord Stuart had traveled to Rome and how his other companions were traveling west. Your presence on the frontier comes as no surprise. Well then, it's an honor to meet you. DeSmet gave no reaction to the flattery. Let us speak with Clement. He should know all that has happened since you parted ways with Stuart. Carnes turned to young Sophus. Give us some time to speak privately. Go check on Vaktar. Nielsen begrudgingly followed orders. Carnes could smell death as soon as the tent opened. Clement was cradled in blankets in a state of undress, allowing his wounds to be tended. Despite the size and strength of the brute, it was clear one of his wounds had become infected. A Bible sat beside his bed, along with other items belonging to the priest. Clement looked first at DeSmet before smiling in surprise at Carnes. Ah, good. We can continue this adventure, he said. I hope his vengeance was worth his life, Carnes thought sadly. First, let me provide information about your companions traveling in the east, DeSmet said. Beginning with the account of Stuart's visit to Rome, DeSmet gave a vague accounting of the travels around the Mediterranean, but after last being seen near Antioch, not even DeSmet's network of agents knew where they'd gone. We kicked the hornet's nest, Clement said when DeSmet's finished. We were hell-bent on revenge and justice for Nicollet, that we didn't think of the consequences. While Eos and the Sinclair families certainly had a part, we didn't understand the influence of one sickly American politician. We should have let tuberculosis kill Poncet. Vendita, DeSmet started. In Italian, it means transfer, which is what happened after Minister Poncet's death. Power transferred to others within the clandestine organization. The Catholic Church believes Vendita is much different than Eos, and as their name implies, they plan on infesting their enemies so that control can be transferred. Their influence on the Russian government, for example, is already being manifested. Russian agents in the Oregon Territory were already hunting for both Eos and your party. They've already infested Washington with their politics and have even set their sights upon the Catholic Church. We believe their plan has been at work for more than a century, so even Poncet was only a disciple of their philosophy. What do they want? Carnes asked. Strangely, they believe Christ will return, but oppose it. At the heart of their tenet is the idea that our world is coming to an end in the year 2061, and the only way to fight it is to eradicate the prophecies within mankind. They want the map? Clement answered. Oh no, it's more than that. Destroying the relics of old certainly helps them, but they want to destroy the system. If they can destroy the Catholic Church, for example, they believe they can free mankind from the impending doom. This philosophy, however, extends to other adherents of the prophecy, which is why they are determined to wipe out the Oceti-Sakowin and the Anishinaabe, as well as any other indigenous people who do not give up the old ways and accept their modern philosophy. So you're not as much an evangelizer as a guardian, Karn surmised aloud. The tent flap lifted a bit, and the blond head of Sophus Nielsen peeked in. Behind him stood a very pale Vaktar Forsberg, who advanced with the help of a crutch under his right armpit. His foot was wrapped in a clean bandage, a sign the wound to his toes had healed. His left arm was also bandaged at the elbow, also without seepage. Taking off the boy's forearm and hand had saved his life. "I'm ready to travel when you are," Forsberg said to Clement, who grinned at the suggestion. "It seems I am the only one holding us back," Clement said, smiling through his pain. My recent brush with death has only motivated me to remember a promise I made long ago. I mean to fulfill this promise, too, with the help of my friends." Carnes looked around the room. They all understood that Clement was dying and that no known doctor could stop the infection from claiming his life. Denying him would take away all the fight remaining in him. "What do you need, Clement? Tell us how we can help." "Bring me home," Clement said. "I need to see it one last time." "Oxford House? We were just at Hudson Bay." "To your father's home near St. Louis?" DeSmit asked. Clement shook his head. "No. I made a promise to her before any of this madness began. Bring me to her home, Matho Paha." Chapter 57. Mato Tapila, 1854. Chief Thunderface began tossing around his bedding in desperation. "Where is my knife? I need to show them I can still protect my people." Finally, the blade came tumbling out of his bed. He snatched it up, strapping it to his waist as his wife looked on with frightened eyes. She held his youngest son, a toddler of 2. "Don't worry, we will overwhelm these trespassers. I only need to whet my blade to keep the younger men in their place. I won't do anything foolish." "Perhaps this would be a good time for a younger man to lead the attack," his wife pleaded. "What else do you have to prove?" "I owe this to my people. I promised them a miracle and only fed them ash." Thunderface felt his heart racing and took a deep breath to calm himself. "Today, I'll make our sons proud." Chief Thunderface focused on his weak knee, and as soon as he tossed open his teepee door, he grit his teeth through the pain, making the young hunter Charging Bear run to keep up with him. His nephew, Standing Buffalo, held his horse, while a few dozen warriors waited to be led. Perhaps I should let Standing Buffalo lead this attack and then support him as chief. If I fail, someone from Standing Rock or Bear Mountain will rightly claim leadership of Siha Sapa. Yet it wasn't the ways of the past, and with so much change happening, dying in combat might be better than the alternative. A bolt of pain came through his leg as he climbed his horse. He fought through the pain and the spots in his eyes for a few moments before turning to his nephew. "Did you find your father?" "No, he's already gone to the Black Hills." Sharing the field with his brother-in-law, Gray Heron, would have helped matters. All he knew was the information provided by 2 teenage hunters. For all he knew, he could be going into a trap. Yet he still had his nephew beside him, along with 3 dozen warriors. "Crawler?" The other young hunter came jogging up to his chief. At seeing him, he ordered, Take one of my horses and ride to Thunder Rock. Tell them we are facing trespassers, and then bring others with in case we fail. You know the pass they are traveling near? Antelope Ridge. Find us there, Thunderface said, and then turned to Charging Bear, who stood waiting. You'll be able to lead us back to where you saw them? Charging Bear smiled, knowing he'd pleased his chief. I do. 2 hours later, they reached Antelope Ridge to prepare the ambush. As the elder strategist, he and his younger officers dismounted and climbed to the top of the ridge. Young Charging Bear came with them, his smile no longer seen. For countless generations, his band, the 5 Lodges, had been given guardianship of one of the most sacred places to the 7 Council Fires nation. The other tribes all knew that the land between Bear Lodge and Bear Mountain belonged to the Blackfoot Lakota, while their closest neighbors, the Siksika, Cheyenne, and Appaloosa, knew trespassing would bring about the wrath of the entire Cheddi-Sakowin. Their western neighbors also knew that the Sioux had weakened considerably in the past generation, especially the Dakota in the east. Perhaps they are only testing my resolve. Charging Bear, lying down on his belly beside Thunderface, pointed off in the distance. There they are. I told you. It looks like they've broken camp already and are heading right into our trap. At the base of Antelope Ridge, his gathered riders were ready to flood in from both sides, while the snipers prepared to fire down on them from the rocks. The trespassers were not in a hurry, a sign they'd been traveling for quite a long time instead of a sneak attack by the Cheyenne or Crow. He studied the horses first, but what he saw only added to the confusion. Arikara ponies mixed with Cree horses. While the Arikara were from the upper Missouri River, the Cree belonged hundreds of miles to the north. Beside the strange horses, he saw the distinctive clothing of white men. Several white men, in fact. He all but gasped when he saw the black robes of a Jesuit priest. Is this a sign? A message? Hold. Tell our riders to hold. He blinked his eyes, hoping to get a little more clarity. The entire party of 30 riders stopped, but not a man dismounted. Then 2 riders, one on a white horse and the other beside the Jesuit, separated from the group, advancing almost half a mile before stopping at the base of the ridge. Traces of red covered the white horse's flanks. But is it blood or writing? The odds of his men defeating a group of 30 armed riders were terrible. While his Blackfoot warriors might have held the element of surprise, the trespassers clearly knew they were being watched, and the price of victory would be too high. With a scowl, Thunderface looked at Charging Bear, who gave an apologetic grin, a slight shrug, and then looked down in shame. My hunters were spotted. Stay here, he said to Standing Buffalo, not wanting to risk the life of his nephew if it was indeed a trap. I will go speak with the man. Thunderface took hold of Charging Bear by his thin arm, pulling him with also. This won't be pleasant, he thought, as he stood atop the ridge and began his descent. For most of the rocky passage, he used Charging Bear as a crutch whenever his bad knee gave out, and kept a hand on the boy's shoulder. The man upon the horse had a familiar look. He dressed like a white man, but had the appearance of a Cree or a Métis. The white horse was marked with red paint, a characteristic often used by the White Lodges. I am Father Pierre-Jean de Smet, also known as the Great Black Skirt. I am seeking entry into the territory of the Blackfoot Lakota. This is a sign of my friendship. The Jesuit lifted a small object above his head. For the next 10 yards, Thunderface ignored it, trying to remember how he knew the other figure. While still on the slope of the ridge, yet still within arrow range, he finally recognized the turtle rattle once given to the great sorcerer Joseph Nicolet. A flood of memories and emotions filled him. He remembered hearing the tales of the man who'd brought the serpent star. After countless months of searching for the man, he remembered Nicolet finding him upon the eastern prairie. But a decade had passed since the joyous meeting. Thunderface looked to the throng of 30, hoping to see the colorful vest of the great sorcerer. Has the great sorcerer returned? No, but we are friends of Nicolet, and we have come in his stead. I know you, Thunderface said to the slouched-over rider. It was then he realized the markings upon the horse were not writing, but also blood. I am Antoine Clement, Brunia Misabe, the brown giant. I made a promise years ago, and I am here to fulfill that promise. And then the brown giant fell from his horse. For 2 days, the body of Antoine Clement was left on a wooden scaffold so that his spirit could find its way to the afterlife. Having spent time with the Lakota, Father Pierre-Jean de Smet understood the significance of the ritual, and after giving Clement's body to the grieving widow, knew he'd be able to perform a Christian burial afterwards. Clement lived another 2 days after he'd fallen off from his horse, allowing time for the estranged wife and daughter to find him before he passed. How could we forget him? Thunderface had said outside of Clement's teepee while Whitefeather and her daughter Little Star sat at Clement's side. He was bigger than my men, stronger than my men, and braver than my men. Of all the women in the tribe, Whitefeather was the most beautiful, but also the most aloof. Her family descends from the spirit lodge of the 5 lodges. Many thought she would never take a husband, but when she saw the brown giant, she gave him the challenge of carrying a buffalo's skull to the top of Bear Lodge, which he did. Within a year, they had a daughter, and Clement was hunting beside my men. When news came that white men were willing to trade goods for guides, Clement promised Whitefeather he'd return the following season. But he never returned. Until today. He'd gone to St. Louis and found a new love. Prior to his death, Clement marked his white horse with drawings of his journey from Bear Mountain to St. Louis and then around the world. Both aging chiefs, Gray Heron and Thunderface, wept when telling stories of Clement and Joseph Nicolet. De Smet carefully pressed them about the significance of Nicolet, the great sorcerer. Having also traveled with Nicolet, De Smet understood most of the reasons, including the arrival of Halley's Comet. As they sat around the fire for Clement's final hours, the old chiefs told their tales about the Serpent Star and the legend of the Wishwe, the Star Man. Gray Heron's son, Ohanzi, fervently believed the tales told by the elders of the Spirit Lodge and departed immediately to go face the shape-shifting Unctehi known as No-Sold. Shortly after, a traveling holy man visited the Black Hills, claiming to have met the Wishwe in distant St. Louis, which shook the hearts of Whitefeather and all who knew the brown giant who'd followed his destiny to the distant city. When the shamans said the Wishwe was indeed in the company of a brown giant, the entire nation believed the stars were aligning for some cataclysmic change. For this reason, Thunderface gathered up his people and traveled hundreds of miles in search of the great sorcerer Nicolet. When they found him, Whitefeather's heart broke when they learned her brown giant was traveling to the far side of the world. Whitefeather and Clement's daughter, Little Star, grew up hearing of their father's exploits from the 2 years he'd stayed with them, as well as myths about his life at Hudson Bay, the Rockies, Minnesota, and his travels around the world. Mother and daughter devoted themselves to the legacy of Clement, and at Bear Mountain, on the edge of the Black Hills, They began a life of prayer and contemplation since she never chose another husband. The people of the 5 lodges, Thunderface explained, are different than the other bands and tribes of the 7 council fires. Their beliefs are much older. They guided our people to this land, a land which we now guard. Whitefeather is part of the Spirit Lodge, those who keep the ancient knowledge about death. The other 4 lodges represent the earth, the sky, water, and fire. Our holy men, like yourself, still worship the Creator, but our stark differences have made it apparent that both cultures have lost pieces of the story. While my people remember the old ways of the Creator, your people carried stories of the new ways of the Creator. I took my youngest son to the holy man Renvel, who baptized him with the name Adam, and since then I've tried to teach him with our legends, especially the old ones. Desmet revisited his grief of losing Nicolette as well as the fresh loss of Clement. His traveling companions also took the loss hard, so the stay at Bear Mountain allowed all to emotionally recover. After 2 days of mourning, Whitefeather and Little Star came out of their teepee. Whitefeather had cut off her hair, a tribute to her fallen husband. Little Star, a maiden nearing the age of 20, had severed the tip of her little finger and placed a dozen wooden pegs through the flesh of her forearms. Her face was blackened with dried blood. She was the most horrifying and beautiful creature Desmet had ever beheld. His spirit had passed on, Whitefeather said to Desmet. You may now have his body. Her Blackfoot family gathered around her and her daughter, leaving the other mourners to tend to the body to Clement's body. Crooked Arm and his lieutenant remained in the company of Stuart's band of madmen. The Serpent Star lit a fire that is still burning. The toothless, red-headed boy Forsberg cried almost as hard as Clement's family. Just a short time ago, the boy had been on death's doorway, but after removing his putrid arm, the boy had grown stronger by the day. With the help of Chief Thunderface, Clement was rushed 70 miles from Bear Lodge to Bear Mountain, where his wife and daughter camped. Unlike the stump-shaped Bear Lodge, Bear Mountain did resemble the hunchback of a great bear, sleeping along the eastern edge of the Black Hills. The people of the Spirit Lodge camped at the base of the solitary butte. And it was where they buried Antoine Clement, Bruni and Misabe, the brown giant. The dozen men spent hours rolling away boulders at the base of the mountain, and in the alcove they placed his body, covering it with dirt before returning the boulders. Clement told me about seeing the pyramids, Professor Morgan said after Desmet finished his Roman Catholic prayers. Now he has a tomb that rivals even the Great Pyramid. A short distance away, the Lakota drums sounded and a chorus of voices filled the air. 5 figures, Chief Thunderface, his son Adam, Old Chief Grey Heron, Whitefeather, and Little Star, returned from the camp to join their guests. Several promises were made, Whitefeather said once she stood close enough to the group, but only one promise was kept. I thank you for bringing him back to me, but now we must speak about what comes next. Neither the professor nor the false lord seemed ready to take the mantleship of leadership, and soon all eyes were on Desmet, so he humbly explained, I only recently joined these men. Part of what you said is true, Whitefeather answered, but your black robe has been part of this story for generations. Let us sit and talk about what happens next. Desmet already knew what needed to happen. He'd bring the 4 weary travelers to Fort Pierre and send them home on a steamship down the Missouri River to St. Louis. Before my husband died, Whitefeather began, he told me about the enemy that struck him down and another promise he'd made. I will stay here and mourn, but his daughter will go with you to finish the journey." De Smet shook his head as he translated her statement to the others. "Clement came for revenge on the men who killed his father, and his revenge has taken his life. The journey's over." "No, the journey continues. Wishwe made a promise generations ago to come back," Whitefeather said. De Smet didn't understand the word she used. Starman? Is she referencing Nicolette the astronomer? Little Star's Lakota name translated from Wishapi, and the word she used sounded similar to the word. What is Wishwe? "The Serpent Star marked his arrival," Whitefeather said. "He is the one who found the weapon to defeat the evil shapeshifter No Soul. Wishwe is the only one who could wield it, and he left to see the Council of Blackrobes. He promised to return with Blackrobes at his side. You are the fulfillment of that promise. You will take his daughter with you so that his destiny can be fulfilled." De Smet learned the Lakota language several years ago, but her isolated Blackfoot variations confused him. "Are you speaking of the great sorcerer who we call Nicolette?" Whitefeather lifted a hand to point to the elder chieftains. "They wrongly believed Nicolette was sent back to us to serve as the Wishwe. But the Serpent Star did not summon Nicolette. It summoned Antoine Clement." For a moment, De Smet almost argued with her confused details. Yes, Clement was in St. Louis when Halley's Comet appeared. De Smet also remembered how Clement took the name Brunia and went ahead to Fort Snelling. When Nicolette arrived, Clement was part of the expedition that went to the headwaters of the Mississippi. "If he had lived, my husband would have returned to Inagiata to battle No Soul." Again, De Smet struggled to understand her dialect. "I don't understand Wanagiata. What is this place?" Whitefeather repeated, "It is a place we call Lake of Souls." Wanagiata, place of souls, De Smet clarified. Professor Morgan cleared his throat. "Clement traveled with Nicolette to a place the Chippewa called Lake Manitou, or Spirit Lake. He told me about it. Once he got his revenge, it's where he planned to go next." "Nicolette planned to map the upper Missouri River," De Smet insisted. Lewis Carnes found his voice. "You were part of a ruse, Father De Smet. Fremont, Geyer, and Stewart were all part of an elaborate bluff." "A bluff? Do you mean that Nicolette never planned on mapping the upper Missouri River? Why did Eos send its servants to the Great Divide then?" "To race Nicolette," Carnes said. "His enemies in Washington made it impossible for Nicolette to fund his plan, but they believed he'd tipped his hand. You were kept in the dark because of your Jesuit loyalties, but your actions helped convince our enemies. While Fremont, Geyer, and Stewart were far out west, Nicolette was planning to return to Lake Manitou." "Yes, Wanagiata, the place of souls," Whitefeather insisted, seeing her support grow amongst the others. De Smet even smiled, thinking how Nicolette had fooled so many. De Smet even gave misleading information to his superiors in Rome. He was several moves ahead of us. Yet the details again confused him. "No, I don't understand. Nicolette never found anything. He was stopped by pillagers. Why do you think Nicolette was the only one who could wield the weapon to kill No Soul?" "I've already told you. The Serpent Star did not summon Nicolette. It summoned Antoine Clement. Clement had the blood of Wishwe flowing in his veins, not Nicolette. Wishwe is the one who made the promise generations ago, not Nicolette." Clement? The ogre was a mongrel. What is she talking about? Nicolette was almost a holy man. Think, what is the Wishwe? Did he woo her with his lies? Did she believe he was someone he wasn't? The man did take on the persona of different names for different people. Did Clement tell you this story? DeSmet pressed. Whitefeather shook her head. No, I told it to him. It was a love story about the daughter of a mighty Dakota chief and a foreigner, a white man. In those days, the serpent star also appeared, a sign that he was the Wishwe, the one who would defeat No Soul by wielding the white egg. Despite the danger posed to her, she took him deep into the land of the Blue Woman, into the haunted valley, where the earth bled blue. Winona showed him his final destiny, and before he could act on it, fate tore these two lovers apart. He was taken back east, and her vengeful father sent her far to the west to live here at Bear Mountain. By the time these two lovers found each other again, both were married. But he proved she was right all along when he unearthed the sacred egg of creation, wielding it for all the people to see. That was when he made the promise to her, to me, to us, that he would return one day with the black robes at his side to fight the evil shapeshifter No Soul and to rip him from his cave. It can't be. She's speaking of Pierre Charles Lesueur. DeSmet knew the legacy of the Jesuits. He knew how in the early days of exploration, the Jesuits sent their brightest and best to follow the mysterious Seven Fires migration of the Anishinaabe into the west in search of the stopping place, a lake with a turtle-shaped island. He knew how the mighty Sioux Empire, the Seven Council Fires, repelled both the Anishinaabe and the French for generations. But a series of disasters led France to the French Revolution, which almost destroyed the Jesuit order. DeSmet was sent back after a generation to make assessments. Because of Joseph Nicolette, DeSmet also knew the legacy of two men who came to the frontier in 1682, a year Halley's Comet appeared to the world. Baron Lahotten's records of his travels were spurious at best. The other account baffled later explorers who went looking for a copper mine that didn't exist. Pierre Charles Lesueur was the Wishwe? DeSmet felt lightheaded. Lesueur had been out on the frontier in the 1680s, returned to France with samples of blue earth, and then traveled up the Mississippi River with a mining expedition deep into the heart of Sioux territory. But Lesueur died in Cuba. Yet Lesueur, like Clement, was a giant of a man. No, that can't be. Antoine Clement Sr., a Frenchman from a family of fur traders, had left the Louisiana Territory for better opportunities on Hudson Bay. Dear God, Lesueur had children with Marguerite Lesueur. She settled with her Lemoyne cousins in the new territory, remaining there even after her first husband died. She remarried Nicolas Chauvin. DeSmet didn't need to see the full family tree to know the truth. Lesueur's blood flowed through the generations to fulfill the promise he made to Winona. Little Star, Wishapi, Wishwe. Chapter 59, Big Stone, 1854. Sophus Nielsen hopped from rocky patch to rocky patch, pretending they were sheets of ice floating on a spring river current. In reality, the field of stone were exposed bedrock that peeked out of the prairie where the retreating glaciers had carved out two waterways, the Red River and the Minnesota River. Down the hill, the camp had been set along the shore of the narrow lake. A few miles north, they crossed a stream that Professor Morgan claimed was the headwaters of two rivers, but it was only a flooded ditch to Sophus. After leaving the Black Hills, they'd cross the Missouri River north of Fort Pierre. Now that was a river. Unsaddling the horses, they had used log rafts to cross and let the horses swim in the muddy waters. Once they crossed, Chief Thunderface brought a few horses to trade for a wagon, which allowed Forsberg, supplies, and even Professor Morgan's prized slab of stone to be carried across the prairies. Another Indian chief, Waneta, recently joined them, guiding them to the crossing place of the two rivers. All told, they had more men now than when they'd arrived in America. Yesterday, the Dakota warriors gathered at the exposed stone to say their prayers, and Sophus was forbidden by the Jesuit priest from bothering them out of curiosity. Today, though, they all hunted and fished to gather for the final leg of the journey, leaving the granite playground to him. It certainly was a majestic patch of stone after so many weeks of seeing grass. It formed the walls of the river valley, which flowed for miles and miles to the south. The Jesuit, the professor, the lord, and 3 chiefs sat together down by the lake making plans for their incursion into Minnesota. Even though he was told numerous times to mind his business, Sophus knew it was going to be dangerous. But it involved some sort of treasure. Clement's daughter, Little Star, walked beside Vaktar Forsberg up the hill. I wonder if I'm in trouble. No one from the camp seemed to be looking at him, a good sign. Nor did Forsberg and Wachapi seem to be in a rush. With the help of Father DeSmit, Forsberg spent the past few weeks trying to tell Little Star about her fallen father, Antoine. Wachapi was beautiful. Sophus couldn't hide his feelings for her, even though she was foreign to him. She had her father's eyes and his height, yet the jet-black hair of her mother's people. Even though she was dressed in deerskin and beads, she walked as if royalty. Sophus looked at his toes once they neared. Father DeSmit told me he thinks he knows where my uncle Dagmar is living, Vaktar said once they were close. How does he know that? Sophus asked. The river in front of you, Forsberg pointed to it with his stub. It flows for 10 days downstream before it reaches a bigger river called the Mississippi. He said a Catholic priest has a church there, and one of the parishioners is named Forsberg. It must be my uncle. I'll show him what happened to me. Are you going to visit him? Sophus asked, suddenly fearful of losing his traveling companion. I'm not sure where we're going after this. They're down there right now trying to figure it out. Once we get to Lake Manitou, we're going to have enemies all around us. Chief Crooked Arm wants us to withdraw west and then return home through Hudson Bay. Do you remember the story I told you? Sophus began, thinking of Hudson Bay. Forsberg frowned. Your ancestors did not travel to America 500 years ago. Sure they did, Sophus defended. While he couldn't be sure of matching the names to the real places, he'd heard the tales told dozens of times back home. Why does everybody doubt me? I was thinking that this was most likely the place where they camped. Professor Morgan said that because of the Ice Age, the rivers were bigger back then. I bet all the water came all the way up to these rocks. If that's the case, I bet they simply paddled up in their Viking ships and anchored here. I bet they were looking for same place we're looking, Lake Manitou. Your ancestors weren't Vikings. You're just saying that to make me mad. I can still kick your ass. I'll shove my stump into your nose. Can't both our families' stories be true? I'm only repeating what I was told. You're making this up, Vaktar insisted. Sophus became distracted by the solemn beauty of Wachapi, whose forehead wrinkled as she listened to them speak. Can she understand us? Vaktar shook his head. They've been pretty cut off where she lives. They've had hardly any white men, even Vikings like you, visit them. A magic egg? I wonder if it connects to Professor's black stone. Why do you think she's coming with us? What's going to happen when we get there? Vaktar shrugged. Does she have a husband? Sophus pressed. I don't know. I don't think so. I think she's like a nun or something. He wasn't acting like she was a nun. Oh, shut up. You're just saying that because you're sweet on her. I'm not. Are too. You're always talking to her. I'm just trying to explain to her a bit about her father. Sophus deflated a bit and remembered his grief. Clement? What's so special about him? I mean, besides the obvious. The way Professor Morgan talks, they think he's some long-lost hero. Do you know the King Arthur stories about a hidden king? Sophus shook his head. You're a Christian, right? Sophus nodded. Okay, then it's like when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and killed the king of Israel, and then 600 years later, Jesus showed up as the lost heir. Apparently, Clement is like that. Clement is related to Jesus? Forsberg let fly with his good arm, striking Sophus so hard in the chest that it echoed like a drum. In hindsight, Sophus realized he'd spoken too quickly. Ow, that hurt! Wachapi smiled, making the act hurt even more. Forsberg stayed in place, his eyes at his feet as if he also regretted the act. Father DeSmit wanted to talk to you. Don't lie to a priest, okay? I'm not lying. Then Forsberg quickly added, DeSmit wants to hear your story. He does? Sophus felt his spirits lift. Forsberg looked at him in the eye and nodded, the closest he'd ever come to believing him. His brow narrowed before he asked, Do you remember a fellow named Aberon or Kokebi? Sophus shook his head. Well, DeSmet and Morgan were talking about those two guys, and when DeSmet heard all about your tales, he wanted to hear you tell it yourself. Fine. Like I said, I'm only repeating what I was told. Both Sophus and Vaktar turned to begin walking back to camp, stopping after a few minutes steps to see why Washapi hadn't moved. Chippewa, she muttered, looking east. Sophus put his hand to his brow, and he saw 3 tan horses galloping toward them. Then he saw 3 indigenous riders. Finally, he saw their bows. Get her back to the others, Sophus said, scrambling down the rock to where he'd left his canteen and pistol. Give me that pistol, Forsberg demanded. No, get her out of here. I'll hold them off. Fire off a shot to get the others. There are 3 of them, and I've only got 6 bullets. Get her to safety, and I'll fire off the shot. Forsberg took her by the arm, hobbling as he ran on his wounded foot. Wachapi looked back at Sophus with concern. That's right. I'll protect you. Sophus took a few steps toward the charging horses, who grew larger with each heartbeat. He glanced back, knowing the riders would reach Forsberg and Wachapi before the camp even knew what was happening. He fired a shot in the air, and then the charging horses slowed, but only to fire their arrows. 2 flew over his head, but a third struck him squarely in the chest. Strangely, its impact was no worse than Forsberg's punch a few moments earlier. They mean to kill me. Sophus lowered his pistol, took aim, and squeezed the trigger. A red splotch appeared on the flank of the horse, which lurched and bucked, tossing its rider. One rider charged forward, notching another arrow. He was bouncing so badly that Sophus fired off 2 misses. The arrow came right at him, striking him in the thigh. This one hurt. But the rider was almost on him. Luckily, the rider was now a larger target, and Sophus's 4th shot struck the rider in his lower throat. He dropped the bow to clutch at his mortal wound. The 3rd rider, who'd stopped, now saw the peril the boy posed and lashed his tan pony. Sophus missed the 5th shot, but hit the rider squarely in the back, yet somehow the man managed to keep riding. Look at that, Sophus thought when he looked down at the arrow sticking out of his sternum. He could see the thread of the arrowhead where it tied onto the shaft. Except for a bit of blood that oozed, it still didn't bother him much. Chief Juaneta's riders were already on horseback and charging up the hill. I think I got them, though. The Chippewa who'd shot him with 2 arrows was dying on the ground. The other was trapped under his fallen horse, and the third was growing smaller by the moment. Well, this will impress with Choppy. The Dakota horsemen rode around the rocks to pursue the wounded rider. Others hopped off their horses to deal with the 2 wounded. In the distance, Father DeSmit took Wachapi into the protection of the camp, while Professor Morgan ran up the hill where Sophus stood alone. One of them shot me with an arrow, but it doesn't even hurt, Sophus called out, pointing to the arrow protruding from his chest. He looked down to see blood dampening his pants. Now that one hurts. It had pierced the flesh just above his knee. Great, now I'm going to have a limp too. Professor Morgan was out of breath by the time he reached the edge of the granite stones. He looked to the bloody Chippewa a few feet away, as well as the one being pulled out from under the horse by Juaneta's Dakota. I think I got, Sophus said before a cough cut him short. He felt dampness on his chin and touched to see blood. Did I bite my tongue in all this excitement? Professor Morgan's eyes grew wide as he climbed up the rock. It's just stuck in my breastbone. It doesn't even hurt, see? Sophus wiggled the shaft of the arrow and then pulled it out. It did leave a jolt of pain, and he gasped at its sharpness. When he did so, a strange sucking noise came out of his chest. Oh no, Sophus thought, and then his world began to fill with dark spots, more blood dripping down his chin. Chapter 60, Coteau du Grand Bois, 1854. To distract his grief, Professor Corey Morgan studied Nicolet's 1843 map of the hydrographical basin of the upper Mississippi River, which Father DeSmit had given him. His copy was one of thousands being made by the federal government in anticipation of the settlement of the region. In the east, Henry Hastings Sibley had quickly organized military expansion to Fort Snelling, and then swindled the Dakota to sell millions of acres for pennies an acre, with special consideration for the half-breeds already living in the territory. Sibley's recent Traverse de Sioux Treaty meant the Dakota would be forced onto reservations along the Minnesota River and taught to farm. It was a lie. From what Morgan could tell, none of Thunderface's Lakota or Juaneta's Dakota understood what the sale of land meant, nor would they become farmers. Already, according to DeSmit, the white population around the stone fort swelled, and politicians and businessmen intended to begin organized settlement as soon as 1855. Any mysteries left undiscovered by Nicolet would soon be plowed over by pioneers new to this land. Yet far to the west, the land remained much the same as Nicolet had seen it, open prairie. After leaving Big Stone, they passed by Takara Lake and then stayed on the ridge Nicolet had drawn to his map. None of these lakes were named, but Morgan understood they camped on what Nicolet had boldly labeled the Coteau du Grand Bois, a ridge separating the Big Woods from the prairie. Nicolet's ridge fed the Long Prairie River to the east and the Osakis River to the south. Morgan rose prior to dawn and was facing the sun as it rose over the horizon. One by one, the other men rose to meet the day. Since the death of young Sophus, everyone wore solemnity on their faces. Nielsen had managed to kill all 3 Chippewa scouts, so news returned to the Big Woods. But the absence of the scouts, so no news returned to the Big Woods. So the absence of the scouts would raise alarm with whoever had sent them. Juaneta suspected Chippewa Chief Sweatingstone. The men began to gather around DeSmit, who served them freshly brewed coffee from his dwindling supplies. Morgan carried Nicolet's map with him, and stood shoulder to shoulder with Thunderface and Winetta, who promised retribution for the boy's death. Morgan sat with the Smith, Lord Erskine, and the Cree chief Crooked Arm, who moved stones in the dirt in front of them. Carnes looked up to see Morgan and explain what had been decided. "It is agreed this is a good camp for staging," he began. "We're halfway to Lake Manitou, and I'll be joining Crooked Arm and Thunderface to scout the area. A decade ago, the pillagers were thick in the area, and most of those men will remember Nicollet, for better or worse. We need to see what sort of opposition we'll face." Opposition? Morgan had not wanted to be part of the planning, and now he began to wonder if he wanted to continue the mission any further. "Chief Wanetta will ride south," Carnes continued. "Many of the peaceful Dakota have already settled along the Minnesota River in the new reservations. Among them is a friend of Nicollet, a man named Tiope. With Tiope's help, we could potentially secure a group large enough to take Lake Manitou by force." Of course, Renville was Nicollet's ally also. Tiope would be protected there. Father De Smet cleared his throat to speak. "If you madmen succeed, we'll need an extraction plan. In the past few years, I've learned what Nicollet suspected to be true of the Catholic Church, and with her motives toward the prophecy unclear, I'll contact other allies in Rome. To do this, I'll go back to the headwaters of the Big Sioux, the thick-wooded river, which runs south into the Missouri River. My appearance on the Missouri River would be expected, and back at St. Louis, I'd be able to arrange the international transportation we'd have." The priest obviously believes we'll find something. "I should come with you to Lake Manitou," Morgan insisted. "Any sort of relics we find might need interpretation." "You'll certainly come with us on that day," Carnes said. "But today, we'll keep you here. From what Thunderface and DeSmit tell me, young Wachapi is as important to this prophecy as the Philosopher's Stone itself. I want you to guard over her. All three chiefs will leave a few warriors here to secure the camp. This will only take a few days. It's a 60-mile ride to the camp, and we don't plan on staying long enough to be noticed." Once again, I'm being treated as a nursemaid. Morgan didn't fight it. He had plenty on his mind. First, he had the boy's smiling face on his mind. For months, Sophus sat listening to his stories about Norse mythology, Atlantis, and the Order of Eos. The boy was a better scholar than any of his university students had been. For each grand tale Morgan told, Sophus tried to top it. Second, he could not rid his mind of the black stone he'd seen at Lake Columbia. Where had the Order of Eos found such a relic? What was its purpose? How were they going to use it? For this reason, Morgan didn't mind staying at camp, since each step east and away from the black stone felt like a betrayal of his duties. Before this is all over, I'll need to go back to Cold Garden. Lastly, he had his masterpiece to finish. It had certainly been comical when Sophus hauled a 200-pound slab of stone back to camp. Nature had molded an almost perfect headstone, it had seemed, and even though the slab of gray rock was far from the supernatural black stone he'd gazed upon, it was an oddity in its own right, so it had become their traveling companion. Back at Bear Mountain, Morgan first took out a hammer and a few small chisels, intent on marking the grave with a tombstone befitting Antoine Clement. But Clement's winter bride, Whitefeather, insisted on giving him a traditional burial. But the idea of commemoration stuck in his mind, and he began to inscribe something else upon the stone, a narrative. They'd traveled over 400 miles since leaving Bear Mountain, and each evening when the men made camp, he added new details to the slab in tribute to Sophus. Now, while the others prepared to go on missions, he again returned to his project, intent on finishing before bringing Wachapi to Lake Manitou. "What's happening?" Vaktar Forsberg asked, looming over the spot on the hill where Morgan had dragged the slab. "Scouting parties," Morgan explained, and told the boy where everyone was off to. "Could I—" Forsberg began. "You can stay here with me and watch over Little Star." Morgan intercepted the request before it could be asked. The boy wanted retribution, but was in no shape to enter a fight. Forsberg huffed with resignation. He'd taken the sudden death of Nielsen harder than he'd taken the death of Clement. With Clement, there'd been the long goodbye, but with Sophus, it had all happened in moments, leaving the spirit of the Forsberg boy in tatters. He knew the boy needed good news, so he added, "I think I'm almost finished." "What is it?" "It's a tribute to Sophus," Morgan declared. Forsberg's eyes filled with tears. He wiped them with his sleeve and stepped forward to study the writing. "What does it say?" Morgan turned the slab onto its butt so that the long, smooth front faced them. 8 Goths and 22 Northmen on this acquisition journey from Finland, far to the west. We had a camp by 2 shelters 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were fishing one day. After we came home, we found 10 men red with blood and dead. Ave Maria, saved from evil. "He'd like that," Vaktar said. It takes our part of the story and it combines it with the story he told about his Viking ancestors. I like the part about the Goths. Morgan turned the slab back to the narrow 6-inch wide side. "On the side I'll write, there are 10 men by the inland sea to look over after our ship's 14 days' journey from this island, year 1362. I was about to add the names of the men Sophus told us about. Do you remember their names?" Vaktar nodded. Mikkels of Fors, Tau Nielsen, Storlum, Fisk, Smed, Lars Marr, and of course, Nguyen. Forsberg rattled them off as if taking a test. "Are those the names of the survivors?" "Oh, the survivors! I thought you wanted the names of the 8 Goths that went with Paul Knutsen and Bishop Bardson, his Northmen." He's describing the first expedition, 1354. "I was going to put the name of the men who came out of the wilderness, the 8 who survived a decade, lost in the frozen north. The name Sophus added to the tale." Vaktar smiled his gummy smile. "Do you remember the battle? Sophus said the 2 expeditions had a great battle out on the frontier. They killed each other until only a handful remained, and then they banded together for survival. The bishop's men were Nguyen Nielsen, Fors, Bjarni Olafsson, and Father Veit. The Henry Sinclair's men were Drummond, Doby, and Morrison, if you are to believe him." Forsberg can't say the dead boy's name. We should have brought these young men on never should have brought them on such a dangerous journey. "You should go with Chief Juanetta." "Why?" "It's the safest path for you." "He's going to Renville's cabin, a settlement with people who knew Nicolette. The men who knew Nicolette will most likely are the same men who know your uncle Dagmar." "You think so?" "I do. You'll be back in a few days. By then, I'll have finished the runestone." "It's better than sitting around here doing nothing." Vaktar gave him a slight nod, and then quietly walked back up the hill. An hour later, the 3 parties departed in separate directions. Morgan remained sitting on the crest of the small knoll, overlooking the wetlands below, where the remaining horses ate and drank. Wachapi remained in prayer outside of her tent, and all the young men kept their distance from the beautiful young woman. "If we do find the Philosopher's Stone in Shagobay's secret cave, Will she be the one to wield it? The lost heir of Pierre-Charles Le Sueur? It begs another question. Whose blood did Le Sueur carry in his veins? What made him special in the first place? A spring breeze came up, and white, fluffy poplar seeds filled the air, carried on the winds from the nearby forests. They covered the faux runestone, and he brushed them away before grabbing his mallet and chisel. Whose name do I carve first? Before Professor Corey Morgan had his answer, a shadow appeared from over his shoulder. A rough hand covered his mouth, and a blade swept across his throat. His blood sprayed onto the runestone, and as the strong hand held him steady for a moment, he saw little poplar seeds sticking in his blood. The hand let go, and he fell beside his work. Before he lost consciousness, he saw a strong Chippewa warrior in full battle attire stride past him to the camp below. Chapter 61, Lake Manitou, 1854. After the din of battle ended, Nanaconan slipped away from his sleeping bride to peer out the door to the starry sky. The sounds had come from the west, but to the north, the sky was filled with splendid color. His father Shagobay told him that the northern lights were created in the days following a great flood, when the survivors were filled by fear at the sudden darkness of both the moon and sun. To encourage his people, the great creator placed great crystals of ice in the north to capture the light of the sun and release it in the darkness of night. His father was a practical man, but his mother told him that when people die and their souls travel along the river of souls in the stars, the ancestors dance when the dead are transformed into new eternal life. After briefly investigating the gunshots in the night, Nanaconan crawled back into bed, hoping his mother's versions of the northern lights was true. The next morning, Nanaconan loaded his rifle, strapped on his knife, and picked up a hatchet, just in case. When he stepped from the bedroom to the central living room, his young bride, Firefly, who he'd married the previous spring, made a mess on the iron stove he'd purchased for her as a wedding gift. She grew wide-eyed when she saw him armed. "What are you doing?" "I have to find out what happened last night," Nanaconan said. Her attention was drawn back to the stove, which produced smoke from the mess she'd made on the surface. Once the crisis was over, she placed her hands on her hips, as if trying to draw attention to their unborn child in the womb. Nanaconan walked over and kissed her on the forehead. "I'll be safe." After the death of his father, Shagobay, Nanaconan went into hiding in Canada for more than a decade. But his duty to his family's legacy led him back to Lake Manitou. His own people feared the secrets his family carried, and for that reason, he kept a low profile after his return. With the support of Nicolet's American allies, he secured several plots of land along the Blue Knife River north of Lake Manitou, where he'd maintained his vigil and built a cabin for his precious Firefly. But he knew what his enemies wanted. Evil slept below the waves of Lake Manitou. He knew it was the Wintermaker, but he knew the metaphors and tales had an even darker truth. Lake Manitou was a tomb. Nanaconan knew the way down to the river, descending rocks that served as a great stair. Natural erosion helped keep the mouth of the cave hidden, since his father had brought Joseph Nicolet years earlier. Yet the kindly French scientist had not been the fulfillment of prophecy, a mistake that cost his father his reputation and life. Along the shore, a few feet above the waterline, a birch bark canoe helped Nanaconan quickly get to the western shore before he'd heard gunfire. He navigated the rocks of the Blue Knife River, and once the current took him into the lake, he began paddling hard. At 34, he was in his prime, a skilled hunter and fisherman able to provide more than enough for himself and his young bride. During his time in the north, he also learned the way of the traditional Metaweewan religion, which was practiced by the Anishinaabe like the pillagers in Minnesota, all the way to their Micmac brothers left behind in Nova Scotia. It helped him understand the differences between the men who killed his father for being a heretic and his family's own secret religious. At the far western shore, he landed his canoe in a patch of cattails. Unlike the granite bluffs on the eastern shore, the western shore was a field of pink quartzite. From what his father told him, his great-grandfather, Weeyipisu, once won a great battle against the Fox Indians and took possession of a relic as old as creation itself, the sacred water drum. Then his great-grandfather waged war against the dwellers of Spirit Lake for 2 decades, breaking their grasp on the region at the Battle of Kathio. Finally in possession of the Wintermaker's tomb at Lake Manitou, Weeyipisu tried to force the Seven Fires prophecy into existence. And likewise, Shagobay, paid the price with his life. Nanakonan's grandfather also fled into hiding after the death of his father, yet passed down the secrets of Lake Manitou to his son. By autumn, I'll hopefully have a son also. Nanakonan readied his rifle, knowing the face of death could be worn by many of his enemies. Nothing on Flat Rock seemed out of place, so he kept walking, entering the tall blue-green grass that grew in the swampy land west of the lake. His father claimed that the magic of the water drum, the original drum from the tales of the first man, changed not only the water and rocks to a bluish-green powder, but also affected the plants and trees that drew life from its ancient waters. A mile west, he came across a slain pillager in the grass, dead from a gunshot through his abdomen. He checked the man's vitals and then inspected his body. He was one of Chief Sweatingstone's men from Leech Lake and had been dressed for battle. 100 yards further, Nanakonan found the battle scene. Dead horses and dead men stained the ground with their blood. It had been an evenly matched pitched battle where neither side walked away. The attacking pillagers likely used the cover of darkness to hit the camp of their enemies, for he came across the dead pillagers along the perimeter of the battle site. Closer, he found something quite peculiar: dead Sioux. Some he recognized as local Yankton Sioux who lived on the prairie near the headwaters of the Minnesota River. Others were alien to him. A fierce-faced elder chieftain, dressed in ornaments befitting a man of great renown, lay dead with a hatchet buried in his ribs, right up beside the pillager who'd also died in the fight. A thick-chested white man, dressed in an expensive vest that made Nanakonan remember the gentle Nicolette, also lay dead with arrows and bullets riddling his body. Then one of the dead moved. Instinctively, Nanakonan aimed at the bloodied warrior, who rolled over onto his back, still holding a blade. "Yep," the bloody brute said. Then he smirked and muttered, "Sakahika Napoe." Water, Nanakonan translated the Cree word, and also fire water, which was a metaphor for whiskey. "Who are you?" The bloody brute lifted his left elbow. "I am Chief Crooked Arm of the Rocky Mountain Cree. Are you going to help me or kill me?" "Let go of your knife and I'll help you," Nanakonan said. "Are these men your brothers?" Crooked Arm asked, glancing at the dead corpse beside him. Crooked Arm was sliced in several places, including an ear hanging mostly off, the blood on his chin aligned with the fatal wound of the assailant's throat. Nanakonan answered, "The pillagers are my brothers by blood, but they are also the men who killed my father. We shouldn't linger long here. The pillagers will send out scouts to find their fallen brothers. I live nearby. I can tend your wounds in exchange for your story." Crooked Arm let go of his knife and raised a bloody hand, which Nanaconan grasped and helped him to a sitting position. Crooked Arm also looked around the battle site and realized he was the sole survivor. "Thank you," he said. Nanaconan asked, "How did it come to this?" Knowing Crooked Arm's friends and companions were among the dead, Nanaconan gave him time. It was only mid-morning, and the blood from the previous night had not yet dried. With a nod from Crooked Arm, Nanaconan helped the battered warrior to his feet. With 2 graze wounds to his left leg, Crooked Arm limped a few steps to the slain white man in the fancy vest and muttered, "I tried." "Who was he?" "He was once a great warrior," Crooked Arm said. "Get me some food and water, and I will tell you about him and his fallen companions." This is the end of Part 9.